Using these tests for benchmarking and understanding your physiology, I think is so important, and it's such a value-added way to advertise and use testing for training.
If the information that you're getting from testing isn't useful for you, it's actually a useless test, in my opinion. So if it's just numbers and you can't do anything with it, my recommendation is don't do it.
It's great advice.
Welcome to Reach Your Apex, the podcast where champions are made and limits are shattered. Neal Henderson is back. A world-class coach, a pioneer in performance training, and the mind behind some of the fastest athletes on the planet. He's here to share the knowledge, the science, and the hard-earned wisdom that separates the best from the rest. Alongside elite racer and coach Zack, Gregg, we dive deep into the tactics, the training, and the mindset that drive peak performance. Whether you're racing at the highest level or pushing your own personal best, we bring you the insights you need to go further, faster, and beyond what you thought possible. From power and endurance to strategy and recovery. If it makes you faster, stronger, and smarter, we're talking about it. This isn't just a podcast, it's your blueprint for success on and off the bike. Welcome to the next level. Welcome to Reach Your Apex.
Hello and welcome to the Apex Coaching Reach Your Apex podcast, featuring coaches and athletes discussing our knowledge and experiences to help you improve your health, fitness, and performance. We're coming to you from Boulder, Colorado, and all around the world. I'm Neal Henderson, founder of Apex Coaching, and I'm here with recently retired professional cyclist Zack, Gregg, who in addition to coaching with Apex, is the performance director with Project Echelon, and today we're going to be talking about testing.
Thanks, Neal. I'm really happy to be here and extremely excited to talk what I think is a subject you're one of the leading experts in the world on. And one of the reasons I say this is the first time that we ever met in the Apex office, you pulled out this binder that must have weighed 25 pounds, and it was just full of lactate tests and VO2 max tests. So I think if anyone talks the talk and walks the walk, it's someone who can say that they've done 1,000 of these tests. So really, what's your background and experience doing physiological testing?
I'm fortunate in that not only have I been able to work with a lot of different folks running tests kind of as the administrator, I've also done pretty much anything I've ever asked anyone else to do as well. And so I've done a bunch of these protocols myself, some of which will never see the light of day, and I'll never ask anyone else to do some of these silly protocols that I've done. But we do have a good bit of information that we've been able to learn through the trial and error process. I tend to take on as many of the errors as possible and not pass them on.
Well, that's very fortunate for your athletes.
Yeah, they're lucky. I'm not afraid to be the guinea pig.
Are you ready to elevate your cycling experience? Discover Blanca Bikes, the premier destination for cyclists in the heart of southern Spain. As the title sponsor of Reach Your Apex, Blanca Bikes offers an unparalleled blend of services tailored for enthusiasts like you. Why choose Blanca Bikes? Ride the latest Cervelo road and gravel bikes meticulously maintained to ensure top performance on every journey. Immerse yourself in the stunning landscapes of the Costa Blanca with tailor-made packages. Whether you're seeking challenging climbs or scenic coastal routes, Blanca Bikes crafts experiences to match your aspirations. From guided tours led by local experts to on-site mechanical assistance, every detail is handled. Plus, enjoy the vibrant atmosphere of the Blanca Bikes Base Camp Cafe in Parsent, where you can relax and connect with fellow cyclists. And if you are serious about your winter training, join us at the Apex Coaching Camp 2025. Don't miss the opportunity to train with the best from November 2nd to November 8th. With only 4 spots left, this is your chance to refine your skills and push your limits in an inspiring environment. Secure your place today by visiting apexcoachingco.com. Elevate your ride with Blanca Bikes and reach your peak potential. We look forward to seeing you in Spain. Go to blancabikes.com for more information.
So I started off doing testing at a significant level in the late 90s, actually as part of my master's work at CU Boulder in the what was kinesiology and applied physiology program, now the integrative physiology program there, as well as actually down at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, where I volunteered with the first national teams for triathlon in 96, and then was coach for the collegiate and junior national team camp in the summer of 1999. So I was able to gain access to actually really some of the top testing and available equipment at the time in both of those environments. Then I had a very great run from 2001 through 2013 at the Boulder Center for Sports Medicine, which is now the CU Sports Medicine and Performance Center. While I was there, we did about 10,000 tests in those 12 years that I oversaw, a mix of them between lactate profile, VO2 max, the wind gate anaerobic capacity, and then the metabolic testing, which that last one, the metabolic testing, is something I kind of came up with our protocol because I needed to learn some information. I was doing the 24 hours of Moab race solo. Like, I'm a little bit more sprint oriented as my capability as an endurance athlete. And by nature, I have that kind of more fast twitch than slow twitch fiber. And so for me, fueling was super critical. And I knew that actually indirect calorimetry, what we can do with oxygen consumption and CO2 production information from a metabolic cart, can tell us about how much carbohydrate and how much fat our body is using during exercise at different intensities. And I had a pretty good idea of how hard I could go or maintain for about a day, 24 hours, And so I needed to know what my expenditure was looking like in that range, and was that the right kind of target.
Yeah, I mean, there you go with being the ultimate guinea pig for testing out a hypothesis on fueling.
And it's fun with that information, the O2 and CO2, we're able to look in combination with the lactate values, which helps us with pacing and understanding how our body's producing that energy. And so was able to determine my needs of carbohydrate intake was actually pretty close to 500 calories of carbohydrate per hour, which there's 4 calories per gram. So that's 125 grams of carbohydrate intake per hour for 24 hours was my target.
And it's amazing all these years later, it must feel like it's come back around, right? Where now it's the new normal. And you're like, hey man, I've been doing this for a decade plus.
It really is kind of funny. Everyone's, high carb now. Because back then, the information that was produced, a lot of it in the 60s and 70s and 80s was that humans can take in and process about 40 to 60 grams per hour. And I was looking at what I was doing, what other endurance athletes were doing, and we were way outside of that. And in the lab, I was able to determine, okay, well, I didn't have all the clearance equipment to look at what's going on the absorption side, but I can tell you people were performing well with high intake, 100 gram, 400 calorie per hour. Again, if the intensity was more moderate. When you get to the higher intensity, we do know that gastric emptying rates start to slow down. And so it is a pacing related thing as well.
I can so appreciate that you were willing to do this on yourself and not ask someone else to do a 24-hour race in your stead. So what other types of testing have you been using over the course of this 25-year career that you really strongly recommend your athletes and listeners of the podcast to explore?
When I was getting into the sports science side in those early 2000s and late 90s, we were just starting to see more of the portable power meter. What we just know is a power meter now. There were few people back in the late 90s that actually had access to that. And so it was kind of limited, and we started to see a definite proliferation of the availability and accessibility of that kind of equipment then in the early 2000s, and being able to then assess outside what kind of capability, power generating capability that folks had outside of the lab really opened up at that time. And it became an increase in need for being able to analyze that data, understand it, sometimes tie it into then what were some of the classic measurements that people were used to seeing in a lab on a bike ergometer rather than on their own bike. The first smart trainer, the CompuTrainer that was, again, more commercially available was like our gold tool. And if you had like a CompuTrainer and a power tap wheel, my gosh, the world was your oyster in terms of being able to do testing and assess performance. It was huge.
Imagine having two types of data to measure those things when most people had none. Yeah, and I think you keyed on a couple there. So you're talking about being on a cycle ergometer and then having this power meter that you can use on your bike when you're riding outside. So yeah, what are the labels associated with those types of testing?
I would kind of consider like three primary types of testing here. So number one, lab testing, where we have significant control over everything that we're doing. We have reliable equipment being used, sometimes even invasive equipment. So, lactate is moderately invasive. We do have to break the skin, whether it's your ear or your finger, or I don't know if there is other places where you can do lactate control. I haven't tested them. Those are pretty much the two standard areas for our venous lactate stick. I've had arterial bloods, which that's totally different, much more invasive, not very comfortable. But with the venous lactate control, we have something invasive. We can put a mask on and measure oxygen and CO2, as I mentioned, with the metabolic testing. And that lab testing environment clearly gives us a lot of information about internally how we're doing work and how the body's responding from those perspectives, from the physiologic perspective. Our second big area is our field testing, where a lot of cases we would do very similar protocols to what we would be doing inside, but outdoors. So a great example was with our cross-country ski team at CU. We were doing testing with them, and in the middle of the summer is where they were trying to set some of their training zones for heart rate, because there's no power meters in cross-country skiing. Well, not really good, reliable outdoor ones I've seen. We have ski ergometers and things like that to measure the power from the upper body, but skate skiing especially is really difficult to monitor that. So you have to look at the body's response. So physiology, looking at the heart rate to determine easy, moderate, hard, et cetera, for prescribing training and ranges for that. And so we had them use a little climb right here in South Boulder, going up above VLA Lake. And I sat at the top with our lactate analyzer, having them go with progressively faster effort, where they did have GPS devices and that heart rate. So we were trying to go about 10 beats per minute harder on average for those 4 or so minutes up the hill each time, and looking at the lactate and seeing where that big jump is. So that's kind of like taking the lab test outdoors. We didn't have a huge 10-foot by 20-foot treadmill that some people do use for roller skiing. If anyone locally has one of those monster treadmills, let us know. We'd love to check out and do some more ski testing on the roller, on the massive treadmill. But doing things out in the field, we can do it on the bike as well. Do a repeat climb and assess the lactate at the top of each time, where we're monitoring the power with the power meter rather than with an ergometer. And then finally, we have our time trials or power duration tests. This is kind of the basic, go out and go as hard as you can for a certain amount of time. And there's also really, I would say, the ramp test that we see now in a lot of smart apps and different training apps out there, that basically 1 minute long stages until you can't. That's really a rip off of the old VO2 max test in the lab, where we do 1 minute increases until failure. When you do that ramp test out on your app, or it's kind of hard to do outside because it's really hard to control that power. I've tried it a lot of times, and it's difficult. I'd say it might be able to be done.
Yeah, I think it's ideal circumstances, right, where you're able to really take that minute and push it. But no, I think the clarity the lab gives is pretty obvious for things like a ramp test or a VO2 max, where blood lactate, we're not down to the watt most times. We're within the range of 5 to 10 watts. Exactly. But I think there's just so many options to choose from that it is really important to have an experienced practitioner to tell you what is the best option to get the testing for the goals that you're looking for, the information that you're trying to find.
On that power duration side of things, there's a large range, right? You can do the classic test. People think about the 20-minute test is like the be-all, end-all. Well, you have to, again, know the history of that and know how to apply it. Number one, your FTP is not your highest 20-minute power you've ever done. I guarantee it is definitely not that. The original protocol that Hunter Allen and Andy Coggan came out with was a maximal 5-minute effort, followed by a little bit of recovery, 5 or 10 minutes, and then a maximal 20-minute, and not just take that 20-minute average, but actually take 95% of that 20-minute. Again, which was preceded by a maximal 5-minute. So you have to be able to pace both that 5-minute effort and that 20-minute effort to be pretty accurate, and also multiply by 0.95.
Are you sure you need to do the 5-minute? Because it's really hard.
I know it is. It's really difficult. And yes, if you want 20 minutes of maximal effort to be associated with really what you could sustain, what we think about that FTP is that maximum sustained power, maximal lactate steady state, lactate breakpoint 2, we could go probably about 10 more names, Dmax, et cetera, that point is associated with that power that can be sustained for about an hour in a well-trained athlete. And so if you're just taking that, even doing the 5-minute and then the 20-minute, it's still going to overestimate it. You need to take that percentage off the top. And yes, you do need the 5-minute ahead of time. Tells you something about yourself. Gives you more like your power at VO2 max, actually.
We're always trying to psychoanalyze, right? So what you're made of, for sure, when you have to do that 5-minute. What are the other types of power duration tests that you would recommend for athletes outside of that 20-minute and 5-minute test?
There's a few different options. So again, our typical lab test we would do be a lactate profile, a VO2 max, and then a Wingate anaerobic capacity test, or a Wingate test. That's 30 seconds all out. In a lab, we're able to do some good information there where we also look at the lactate and clearance. But those power profile durations, again, from the kind of originators of a lot of this, Hunter Allen and Andy Coggan, they had the profiles of elite world-class athletes plotted out for their peak 5-second, peak 5-minute, peak 20-minute, and peak 1-minute power. And it was like, when I saw that, I was like, it's pretty nice and easy to be able to summarize a given individual's capacity across all those. But instead of doing those all as separate tests on separate days, I just said, let's throw it all together, because in road cycling, a lot of times we do actually have to do a range of different intensities in any given longer road race, a circuit race, maybe not, or an individual pursuit. No, it's kind of one and done. But more often than not, knowing that entire spectrum of ability is good, and just taking one day for the testing in the field is a really good way of doing that. And that's something that I kind of put together with the Sufferfest, the training app way back in the day, to have that 40p or 4-dimensional power based on those 4 values, 5-second, 5-minute, 20-minute, 1-minute, in that order. Another really good way that is, I'd say, pretty common these days is doing critical power testing with a 3-minute effort all out. That's kind of more like that VO2 max, a 12-minute effort, and then often a 30-second effort to get at least 3 different points and being able to plot out. And then kind of critical power is slightly different than FTP for sure, but it is kind of a repeatable and reliable way. So I do like that, the critical power testing as well.
And for some of my athletes, the critical power testing is a little bit more palatable.
Shorter, so it's easier. It's not easier. You go harder, man.
Exactly. Maybe it's just over sooner.
There it is.
And these tests do share some commonality. We're relying on external data. So how hard you're pushing on the pedals for 1, 5, 20-minute power. And then we're extrapolating from that things about your internal physiology. When we're using a lab, we can see internal changes in key biomarkers. Is that right?
Yeah. There's definite differences when we just do power duration. That external output is very useful and good information, but it does not give insight into how you accomplish that. And that's the thing where the lab is always able to give you more insight into how you're achieving whatever output you have. To me, again, they serve different purposes. They can be done sometimes in conjunction. I've actually had folks with a metabolic mask on during the 5-second, 5-minute, 20-minute, 1-minute protocol. It's pretty mean. I apologize to you, Mac, for putting you through that. But again, I had also done it myself, so it's possible. I wouldn't recommend it though. So we kind of divide those out into those different ways to get that different information that is useful in each one. In a lab, there's probably a few tests that I would consider to be our kind of more primary things that we recommend doing, rather than the stuff that we just can do, because we can do a lot of crazy stuff. But things that are going to be useful. Number one for most folks, a lactate profile, where we start at a relatively easy intensity, and then every typically 4 minutes increase a linear amount of work, and we assess heart rate change. We look at lactate at the end of each stage, and also perceived effort, how hard you're working, is going to be the thing that helps us identify where that lactate breakpoint is, as well as then appropriate training zones for heart rate, power, and perceived effort, from what you would truly consider zone 2 based on the physiology, all the way up to that threshold or FTP type work, and even into the VO2 max range. We don't get anaerobic capacity or sprint type of target training out of a lactate profile generally, but the majority of training is clearly occurring at, say, VO2 max intensity and below. But the stuff that you do at the high intensity, it is useful to know what kind of target. So we just can't get it from that information. Second test that's probably most useful is, honestly, it's that same metabolic test, but it's that same lactate profile test, but adding the metabolic measurements of oxygen consumption and CO2 production, because that tells us then the carbohydrate and fat use at each intensity. I call it a fuel test. I love acronyms. The fuel stands for fuel use evaluation, and I'll put with in parentheses, which there's no W in it, L for lactates. So fuel use evaluation with lactates is the fuel test. FUEL, all in caps. That's what we use to get that energy expenditure. That's that old school one 20 some years ago, did for the first time to help pace and determine fueling intake needs.
And that's just a boatload of data for the amount of time and the ability to do it in a submaximal test.
Yep. For folks that are doing longer events, really critical, or trying to just dial in their fueling needs, whether they're trying to maintain weight or gain weight or lose weight, all of those things are pretty important in that range. The test that most people think about in a physiology lab is what I put third on the list here, VO2 max. Yes, it is useful information. We are looking at your peak sustained oxygen consumption. We look at that in liters of oxygen per minute as well as relative to your body size. So it's milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. We can also, if we do, say, a fuel test and go to absolute max, which is kind of a mean way of doing it, we can look at where your lactate break point is as a percentage of your max. That way, because it'll tell us a little bit about where your maybe potential is. As a great example, we actually tested Sepkus for a pro team many, many years ago as he was still, I think he was maybe graduated from CU or in his last years or just after. And the team wanted to see, what his physiology looked like here. And even though he had extreme capability, right? His Strava records are kind of legendary from that time frame. His physiology, his peak VO2 was very high, but his threshold or break point was occurring at a pretty low percentage of that. It's kind of like having an engine that can rev really high but can't sustain very close to that. That meant he had opportunity to train and be able to bring up where that break point is, to get up closer to 80, 85, maybe even 92% of that red line. And so he had a lot of potential, which he has expressed since that point.
Yeah, you love when it works out, right? You see some biomarkers and you're like, oh man, like think of this guy in 5 years. And then in Sep's case, it really, he worked super hard and developed that physiology to match what his potential was.
Exactly. And it's just fun to see how that does play together. In the lab, another test that we sometimes will do, again, depending on the kind of sport or athlete that somebody does, the anaerobic capacity, that Wingate test where we can look at peak power and the rate of power decline over 30 seconds. Probably the most important part of this is actually the recovery portion where we're looking at the lactate in recovery every 2 minutes for 10 minutes. It can tell us a bit about that ability to recover from really heavy efforts. We would do this kind of testing a lot of times like with our, say, ice hockey players that do really intense effort and then they have to sit down. So their recovery is actually really critical to be able to continue to play well, or track racers, track cycling, a lot of the efforts, not all of them, or most of the races do have a pretty considerable anaerobic capacity, and then that ability to repeat and keep doing, whether it's in a Madison or a team pursuit. That recovery aspect is really critical and tells us a lot of useful information. But those four, so the lactate profile, the fuel or metabolic test, the VO2 max, and then anaerobic capacity are kind of our four classic. Fun thing about that now is we can also add in stuff like monitoring heat production and sweat rate as well. And so we can tie a little bit of that again in a lab situation and see what's going on with core sensors or the NICs or the H-drop or all these other sensors now that we couldn't do, in the past. And now they can take that and train with that information as well.
It's an amazing range and depth of testing that we can do. So it almost begs the question of why aren't folks running to these labs to get tested? And maybe it comes down to practitioner experience and the execution of these tests. So I think my big question is, what mistakes do you see with physiological testing?
There's a few things. Number one, people kind of wait to test until they're fit. So a lot of times when people know that I'm a physiologist and I have a lab, they're like, oh, I'll come in when I'm ready. It's like, no. Like you want to actually test early to make sure that the training that you're doing is right on point at the right intensity relative to your actual current ability, not the ability you want to have. It's going to help you get there a little bit sooner. Not taking the route, but trying to find the way to get to the end, but without good waypoints, it's not going to help you get there any quicker. So don't wait to test. Come in early, typically in the first few weeks of a training block. Is the ideal time. Yes, you're not at your best. That's not what we're here to see in a lab. Go and race. We'll see if you're the best when you race, and if you're not the best, that's okay. We can help you get better. Can't always make you the best though.
Yeah, much harder to see a 10% increase in performance when you're already fit. So come in early and then see those all those charts look so much better in 3 months.
Exactly. That EP test then super useful if you get that earlier test. Number two mistake often is that just not having accurate or calibrated equipment. So, you got to check the lab environment that you're going to. Is it a reliable source of information? Do they keep their equipment up to date? Is everything accurate and reliable? Do they use proper protocols, etc.? So you can ask around on that a lot of times, and you'll find out this place you might want to avoid because maybe they're just using grad students that's at a university and there's literally turnover every, 3 months, 4 months. It's a new person learning how to do it and they still haven't perfected how to do it properly and they make some mistakes along the way. I've seen some pretty, we'll just say unbelievable test results from different, especially, and I'm not going to blame these places, but from a lot of universities, you see some tests that are done that are just really, whether it was the equipment, the practitioner, who was running it, the protocol they used. Sometimes we just see some pretty unbelievable things, and not in a good way.
And to that point, in grad school, I had a professor show us how to do skin fold caliper testing, and we did it all in the same test subject, and all came back with very different results. And so his challenge was go do 1,000 of them and see how close you would be to my results.
Exactly. There is that skill development in any kind of testing situation, knowing what you need to do. I run tests sometimes and I'll see a lactate value. I'm like, nope, I missed it. I know it's not right. Whether I got a little bit of salt in it, because most of these are actually measuring a sodium lactate. So if you're getting any bit of sweat in that sample, you have corrupted it and it's going to read very high in that case, or there's lots of errors that you can make, but that's just one example. The other thing is then not repeating the same protocols or comparing one test to another. So if you come and test here and then you go to San Diego and do a test, well, there's some differences. We are at a moderate elevation here, close to 1,700 meters. Sea level is 0 meters approximately. And so if you compare that 1,700 meters versus 0 meters, you're going to see some differences in that way. Or if you use a totally different protocol, if you do, a 30-second ramping test, that's just a continuous ramp versus a 1-minute stage test, you're going to see some differences in that way.
So yeah, it seems like really going to lab and having the same person do the same testing on you is the most ideal situation. But if that's not available to you, and the only thing that you can do is field testing because you aren't able to drive several hours and go to Neal Henderson in person, what are some of the things that we should know about field testing before we send athletes out to go do it?
Field tests can give you a little bit of that best of both worlds. We can combine some of the invasive measures from a lab, but give you that kind of freedom of movement and be actually out in the environment. So you're still going to need some bit of equipment and expertise. Today, you can buy portable lactate meters now for just a couple $100 in the test strips. You still need to have proper protocol of how you collect the sample. Again, mistakes are made there, so there's some pitfalls to it, but it allows you to do a similar type of assessment. You could even do it on your trainer. If you have a smart trainer, you could do very rigid increases and do it very similar to the way the lab would do it with that. You just might not have, the VO2. You might not have the metabolics. You might not have the sweat and temperature measurement. You might not have those additional things, but it is useful in that way. Some of the minuses we have are the accuracy and reliability of some of the tools or instruments you're using. So even just something as simple as a power meter, you have to do your zero offset or calibrate at the start of any one for that to even just be potentially accurate. That being said, there's always going to be some margin of error on a power meter, plus or minus, typically 1% to 2% for most commercial power meters, but we also do see some that get way out of whack and it doesn't make any sense, and then it's really difficult. If you see somebody who has a 500 watt FTP and they weigh 70 kilograms, but they're finishing in mid-pack in a Cat 3 uphill race, it's probably not real. That power meter is probably off. Unfortunately, it's not reality. I've had to break the news to folks that have done their own tests, and they, their values that they've seen are heroic, or their Garmin or other device has said their VO2 max is 80 mLs, and we actually hook them up in the lab and they're like 60 something. That's a big difference. And it's kind of like, okay, I got to bring you back to earth. There's a reason that you haven't won any races yet, because that number isn't necessarily real.
It goes back to the old saying of to test is to know, and to level your expectation with the reality is so important, especially in an age where your head unit is telling you these things, or you have GPS or Strava, or you're looking at other people's data online. So are there tests that you're recommending to athletes, or are there tests that are necessarily better than other tests that people can do on their own?
Probably the most important thing is for whatever protocol you're going to be using is to be reproducible, that you can do it again and see and assess changes over time. Whether you're doing kind of that 20-minute type of effort, again, make sure you do that maximal 5-minute beforehand if you're going to do it, and then do that 20-minute effort. And again, if you're going to use the value from that 20-minute, take 95% of it to set as your FTP and do it on the same course. So if you do it one day on a flat road on your road bike, and then the next time up a hill on your gravel bike, and you do it a third time on your TT bike because you're doing a triathlon or a stage race and you need to do that, like you're comparing apples to oranges to, I don't know, Tangelos or something like that. They're all a little bit different. They're similar, maybe. I guess I could use maybe all citruses. So like a lime and a lemon and an orange, and they're all citruses, but they're still different. They're not the same. You can't compare absolutely differing equipment, differing courses, differing durations. If one time you do it 10 minutes and another 15 minutes or 20 minutes, that's not reproducible. So you want to repeat the same protocol that you're going to be doing. Really important.
Would the Zwift ramp test be a tomato in this analogy?
As a tomato, yeah. Let's go with that. And a ramp test. And most of these are generally a 1-minute progressive increase. You pedal till you can't. And then it's just a very simple, again, the fancy word is algorithmic determination of your FTP. It's basically most of them take 75% of the highest 1-minute power to estimate your FTP. The thing is, there's a huge amount of variability on any ramp test results. And we actually, in our lab, we have a ramp test. We actually typically first do a lactate profile. So our standard protocol, we do a lactate profile where we have 2 5-minute long, very easy, low intensity efforts as part of our warm up, and then start at 50% of FTP and increase up 8% every 4 minutes. And we're looking at heart rate and lactate and perceived effort. And we are looking for the point where there's a 1 millimole increase in lactate, followed then by a greater than 1.5 millimole increase. This is a testing protocol and a way of analyzing this data that I've been doing for over 20 years. Some of it is published, did some of this with ACSM. It is the way we do it, and it's pretty darn tight to a 40-kilometer time trial. That's part of that, some of that research. That test is our first step, and then when we do the VO2 max, we actually load up a ramp test, which actually even has a little shaded stage and even a dotted line where if you ride that ramp to this point, that would effectively, that point in time along, I don't know, it's stage 8 or 10 or 12, whatever. If you get to that point, the algorithm is going to say that's your FTP. Well, we do this with the VO2, with the mask on, and we're measuring VO2 max, and almost everyone that I've had has exceeded where that FTP value is compared to what we actually see with lactate, because people have some anaerobic capacity that they can push beyond where that actual true break point is as 75% of that. Most people can go beyond that point. And so the estimates for most of those ramps tend to overestimate actual FTP. If you really want to know, do a 1-hour TT at that value, like a day or two later or 3 days later. If it says, you can do Y watts, well, just go ahead, warm up, and hold Y watts as long as you can.
And the listener should know that you've actually done that.
I've done that a lot of times. I have at least, I think, 8 or 10 1-hour all-out efforts over the past 5 years alone. I like to compare and contrast different protocols to what's actually possible and real.
So you can say with authority that it overestimates.
Keeping it real, man. And again, your lactate doesn't lie. It's not a personal thing. It's not a judgment. It's just a reality, a physiologic change. And being able to see that is pretty useful.
Yeah. So how often do you recommend folks test and retest?
Most folks probably would be ideally suited to have 2, maybe 3 tests in a year. First one, again, early in training, in the first 2 to 4 weeks is the best. Really get a couple weeks of moving consistently. You're not going to be doing your hardest training in those first 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks. If so, you're really doing it wrong. But doing that testing early on is really useful. Get those values, targets set. Do a training block. That's going to be typically at least 2 months, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, maybe 16 weeks. A good block of training, and then reassess. Do the same test. What kind of comparison, what kind of improvements have you made? Most people will make the greatest gains in their entire season in those first couple months, first 2 or 3 months. From there, if you're going to be able to do a third test, often it's either going to be just prior to a major long distance event where we might do that fuel test, say somebody getting ready for the Leadville 100 or an Ironman. That fuel testing, I've done plenty of tests myself and with others, literally race week on Tuesday or Wednesday and the racing Saturday or Sunday. That helps us get that absolutely fine-tuned fueling strategy based on their actual current physiology going into the race. The other way is sometimes if it's a shorter event that you're going to recover from fairly quickly is to do a kind of post-event test. And you can see again what your performance was and what your associated physiologic capability was a couple days later. And that's nice just to know if somebody has a really good performance, you can see what's associated with that. And so in the early season, how far off are we? What kind of gains do we need to get to a similar level of performance?
Using these tests for benchmarking and understanding your physiology, I think is so important, and it's such a value-added way to advertise and use testing for training.
If the information that you're getting from testing isn't useful for you, it's actually a useless test, in my opinion. So if it's just numbers and you can't do anything with it, my recommendation is don't do it.
It's great advice.
All right. Well, just to summarize, Zach, testing can be done in a variety of ways, and depending which methods you use, you're going to get different information. Lab tests are going to tell you generally how you're able to produce that power, how your body is actually working from that internal physiologic perspective. Field tests might give you a bit of extension of some of that physiologic measurement into the kind of competitive or real world, whereas that performance testing, power duration especially, is going to give you insight into what your current capability is, and it can be a really good way to help you gain confidence if you're repeating the same tests over time and seeing the improvements that you're making with the training that you have done.
Definitely. And listening to you speak, I think one of my big takeaways as well to test is to know. You shouldn't be afraid to check your progress and know where you actually are during your training so that you can inform and move forward using these physiologic measures to ensure your training is moving in the right direction.
Wasn't it Socrates, know thyself or something like that? Or is that at the Oracle of Delphi? Or I don't know, some ancient Greek stuff. I think know thyself is in that realm. So
I'll have to test that theory on to being Socrates, right?
Well, we'll get on to our ancient Greek history shortly.
Next episode.
Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Reach Your Apex podcast. If you found value in today's conversation, we'd love for you to subscribe to our Apex coaching channel on YouTube podcast so you can never miss an episode. Share this with your friends, teammates, training partners, or anyone you know who's chasing their own Apex, because reaching your peak is better together.
Let's keep the conversation going by leaving a comment below or reaching out on our social channels at Apex Coaching Co. with your biggest takeaway or questions for future episodes. Until next time, we hope you'll use today's episode to keep pushing and striving to achieve your own peak endurance experiences.
That's a wrap on this episode of Reach Your Apex, but we're just getting started. If you're serious about taking your performance to the next level, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. New insights, new strategies, and next level training advice, all right here, only on YouTube. Got a question? A topic you want us to cover? Drop it in the comments below. We're reading, we're listening, and your question just might be in the next episode. We're all about pushing limits, breaking barriers, and reaching new heights. Until next time, keep grinding, keep growing, and always reach your apex.